Welcome to Project Onward's panel discussion on Outsider Connections, our current online exhibition. I'm Nancy Gomez, Executive Director of Project Onward. Robin Jablonski, Studio Manager of Project Onward, who's been with us for 9 years. She's also an artist in Chicago. Rob Lentz, also an artist with an MFA from the School of the Art Institute, founder and former Executive Director of Project Onward, and currently on the board of the Intuit Museum. Fahim Majid, an artist, a curator, a community activist, and former executive director of Southside Community Arts Center, as well as the founder of the Floating Museum. Randy Vick, an art therapist, professor emeritus at the School of the Art Institute, also on Intuit's education committee and a consultant for Project Onward. Welcome and thank you for being on our panel. Let me tell you a little bit about Outsider Connections. Through form, content, or style, artwork by Project Onward Artists, we continue to find parallels with environmental, societal, and economic factors that establish an artist as having the distinction of outsider artist. How does this relate to the artists of Project Onward who work both in a community of unique artists and at home, sometimes with family or friends around them, and sometimes in isolation? Inspired by the work of various artists in this genre, Project Onward looks to question, if not always answer, and challenge what the next step in this genre of art will be moving forward. We mean to open a visual dialogue with the viewer in hopes that more questions and curiosity about these forms of art emerge. Robin curated the Outsider Connections exhibition for us. What would you like to say about this?
Well, I'd just like to tell you a little bit about why and how this came about, the idea for the exhibition. So in January 2019 was the first time Project Onward participated in the Outsider Art Fair in New York. And the booths were representing disability studio programs primarily in one section of the fair, and which was like an L shape, the outer portion. And the majority of the central space was occupied by established galleries, contemporary or historic outsider art brut artists. And what I was thinking was like, wow, this is a different kind of separation. And as this disability arts row is kind of in the back of my mind. So in practice though, however, I found that the collectors and the people were equally interested in pieces through collectors as they were with these other disability studios that were around the country who were participating in this fair. Such as Creative Growth, Land, Sage, and Project Onward. In January 2020, we came back again, and I observed quite a difference in the way that they set up the art fair. Everything was dispersed between, it was kind of mixed in between collectors, galleries, and disability art studio spaces. So I thought, wow, this is a major shift in the way, I don't know if it was intentional that they did that, but it was a major shift in the way that they presented the fair. So, you know, it was a kind of a proud moment for us at Project Onward and other disability arts studios, because to be alongside such important artists in that genre, such as Martin Ramirez or J.J. Cromer, Madge Gill, like it was pretty nice. And I had never seen that before. So I'm like, what if we did something that, you know, our artists, because we do make these connections between visual similarities as artists and as people. And so I thought, hey, wait, well, what if, we paired up our artists with somebody that we thought maybe there was some kind of connection, either in style or form, or just kind of, the heart of what kind of art they were making. So I assigned the artists to everyone to maybe do some research. Some artists looked at me like, what? Why would I do this? And then other artists were like really open to doing a lot of research. Artists that I didn't really expect to be as, who were not normally academically, doing that kind of research, but somebody like Ruby, who I can show you her piece right here. We compared with Lee Godey, and it was kind of more about the essence of the work and her persona.
Great. I just wanted to let everybody know that if you want to look at the exhibition, it's currently on the Project Onward website. So let's get right to this then. Let's start with some questions. First question is, what connections do you see between Outsider, Folk, Art Brut, and the studios for artists with disabilities? Who would like to start that out?
Well, I looked at that question, and I mean, there's a couple of different ways to approach that, and I guess I often think about the things surrounding the artwork, because ultimately, I think in all of these categories, it is about impetus. It is about art making. And the question is like what surrounds that thing, what surrounds it, and going back a little bit to the show and your observation from 1 year of kind of, I think you were getting a sense, Robin, of isolation, where kind of like this is the disability section, and then next year there's this kind of vetting that almost happens. I think that's what you're referring to. And,
right.
and I think all around all of this, we're talking about a marketplace. I think that's what it is, because if it wasn't about a marketplace, I don't think even the notion of the fair and all of that is a space. We're not talking about inclusions in museums. We're not talking about inclusions in curriculum. We're talking about a marketplace. And I think in a lot of ways, even at Project Onward, one of the things that a lot of the artists get excited about is when someone comes in and buys something, then all of a sudden everyone's trying to like ram up, and there's a healthy level of competition, which I do think is important. So in the things that you said, those labels all feed into, in this case, I think, into a market space, right? They're labels that kind of help frame the value of something or the place, like its space in the market. Where does it go? And I think the thing that you're asking about in those labels, specifically with Project Onward, which more so speaks to artists with certain types of disabilities or cognitive delays, is this kind of marching into that space, right? To be included into that space versus the auxiliary thing. And I guess the question to me kind of comes into how does it fit in as well. So whether it's Brut, outsider, intuitive, ultimately, I do feel like how the labels are displayed is a control thing. And at the end of the show I curated, my conclusion was that you don't have to be omni, we're complex. And the assumption that these artists are oversimplified is an illusion, that the artist can actually tap into any one of those identities if they, identify with it. Who's to say an artist is an art brute? Who's to say they're an outsider? Who's to say? You can say you're none of them, or you can say you're all of them in a certain sort of way. It's a power shift. You can either put someone in a box, or someone can like leverage a cap to
or
say,
they're all
hey,
just artists, right?
they're all artists, but at the same time, I just believe in shifting things. Like, I mean, you're kind of like and I won't take over, but the very fact that you're going to an outside arts fair, and we talked about trying to get to spaces like Expo, It means that you're trying to leverage a label in order to be a part of a system to sell the work, which isn't a bad thing, but it's like understanding the power dynamic of when you control that versus when you're forced into it.
Right.
So, you know, I'll end there and we can kind of pick up on it later.
Sure. Randy, do you have any thing to say about connections?
Well, I mean, Fahim talked about those labels as marketplace tools, and I would agree they are, and to some degree art historical discussion tools. But to me, the connections are stronger at the production level. I think many times what you see in the work in all those categories relates to things like people finding their own ways, teaching themselves with materials. And so they're coming up with work that is distinct from the kinds of things that people produce when they have the nuances of things like perspective and other kinds of refinements that come from a formal art education. And so to me, that's one of the pieces that's in there. The other is this sort of distinction of being outside of the idea of a marketplace and the idea of an identity as an artist. And people tend to be working much more directly. They're not concerned necessarily. They're delighted when work sells, but that's not necessarily why they began. And they many times do not begin to think, well, this is a career move or this is a professional identity. It's really a much more direct, straightforward engagement in art making at its more fundamental level. So those are, I think, are sort of production distinctions that shape the work, shape the look of the work, and also shape the marketability of the work.
Exactly. Yes, I agree. Rob, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, I mean, I think just to kind of get to what Randy was saying about production, I think that if you're looking for a sort of a fundamental connection between, say, a Project Onward artist or any artist who's working in a progressive studio setting, those artists have been selected and are placed in this environment because they are considered artists. You know, there's a artist label has already been applied, and regardless of how they're accustomed to making their own work, and a lot of them are self-taught, they're in this environment where they are with other artists creating artwork. And so there's a commonality to just being there. There's a commonality to the number of studios like Project Onward that have proliferated in the last few years.
Around the world, right?
Yeah. And so but I think what connects all of that to the sort of classical definition of an outsider artist is that these are human beings who must make art. They make art because they feel compelled to. They may not consider it artwork in the first place, which is where other perspectives come in. But it's a response to something that's very innate in who they are. So they're going to make this work, in some cases, whether the studio is there or not.
Right.
By placing them in the studio environment, you're giving them the tools and the outlet to express themselves. So that's the site of production that Randy was talking about. To Fahim's point, then you enter the marketplace. And one of the reasons that I think these studios have proliferated so much recently is because there is a market for the work. It's not, we've gone beyond the sort of confines of just the community-based social service sort of medical model, and it's now a full-on marketplace. And I thought it was really instructive, Robin, that you talked about being at the Outsider Art Fair, which is absolutely a marketplace, and it is a marketplace for collectors. And it's really about who is looking at this work, who's interested in this work, who's following it, And I think we've reached a point now where the canon of our outsider art, the sort of blue chip artists, you know, that's a finite commodity. And
Right.
so there's a lot of collectors who are looking for artwork that captures the same sort of spirit or comes from the same kind of place, that occupies this space of authenticity and originality, and doesn't have references to artwork that came before it, exists outside of sort of the mainstream. And so I think there's a, and I've observed this with Project Onward and at being at the Outsider Art Fair too, is that people have a real visceral reaction to a lot of the work. In many cases, not all cases. Some people are there to invest. You know, some people are there to, you know, put their money in the next big thing. But one of the, you know, sort of one of the foundational, I think, impulses of the outsider arts collector is just a passion for the work of these particular kinds of artists that is different from what you're going to see in a mainstream commercial art gallery. But we're at a point where all of these things are starting to blur together, and you have artists like Dan Miller at Creative Growth, many artists at Creative Growth who have entered major collections in mainstream institutions. You have major museums putting on shows of outsider artists. You got the Bill Traylor show. You got many instances of this sort of coming together of connections, if you will. So I think there's a lot to unpack there, but I think it does, for me, sort of go back to as Randy was saying, that site of production and what are the connections there, and to kind of touch on the idea that the artists are making their work often without a conscious influence from other artists or particular styles, or the kind of influence that you would expect from art history or mainstream art education.
Right.
In those institutions, but you still see connections between artists, and I think that's just a human thing that you're going to find in a certain large enough sample of artists who have no other connection to each other consciously. You're going to see patterns that emerge.
Right. Thank you. My next question is, art has been used as a visual tool for diagnostics in psychiatry or other therapeutic practices in the past. What kind of correlations do you see between art made in psychiatric hospitals, prisons, and disability art studios like Project Onward? Who wants to start off?
Maybe I should start that, given my previous career in psychiatry. But when I read that, I thought of this great quote from Hans Prinzhorn's Artistry of the Mentally Ill, where he says, anyone unable to make a diagnosis without the drawings will certainly not have an easier time with them. And so, if you want to put your finger on Prinzhorn's book, 1922, as one of the first sort of declarations of the question of art as a diagnostic tool, I mean, he basically dismisses it, and not completely, but he basically says that's not the main purpose. And his work as a psychiatrist, he basically says, the art is one feature. But you have to look at the whole person, their behavior, the things they say, the things they do, their context, their background, and that all remains true. I mean, certainly diagnosis in any sphere is looking at a complex situation, and you're trying to look at it from all angles. I mean, we're living in a moment of this coronavirus where, you know, physicians around the world are struggling to make sense of the complexity of that particular phenomenon. So, you know, diagnosis in psychiatry is no less complicated, and art may be for certain individuals a useful entryway to that, but not so much in others. In contemporary art therapy practice, you know, that's a consideration, but I wouldn't say a major one. It's really more of the art process as a tool of therapeutic engagement rather than a diagnostic one.
Then do you
More
find...
of I'm sorry.
No.
So more of a tool for healing.
Yes, rather than diagnosing and labeling. And so when you look at those categories that you list in the question, you know, psychiatric hospitals, which of course, you know, at the time of Wolfley and Martin Ramirez are very different places than they are now. And prisons and the disability studios, I mean, all of those are linked to people at various sorts of social isolation of people and marginalizations, people who are in some form of distress. And also back to the, you know, response earlier, also people who are not necessarily trained and or encouraged to make art. So they're really working outside of that kind of salon tradition that, you know, many historical and contemporary artists are familiar with.
Yeah, and I think I would add to that the idea that visual art is a tool for communication also for people who are nonverbal or have difficulty expressing themselves any other way, which is, you know, could be considered a therapeutic tool, but also could be, you know, a survival tool or a way to communicate things that they wouldn't be able to ordinarily say. And you know, that's a tool that's available to
We
all.
do that every day there at
all
Project
artists.
Onward.
Yeah, but regardless of whether you have a disability or not, that's a tool that many artists use to communicate ideas that they might not be able to communicate otherwise. But I think in the case of artists in these studios, that is a real compelling outlet for them.
Do you find major differences in content, style, or vision? I mean, we talked about the correlations between the art made from psychiatric hospitals and prisons and stuff, but what about the actual art made? What about the content of the art that's being made in these places?
Well, so once again, it's a question of, I was just looking at some images on Instagram of a artist that conducted a wine and sip. You know, these things where you come out and you drink and, you know, you paint on the easel and then we go out to a club. Right? I mean, that is like artwork, right? So, I mean, it's not great, but so I think once again, the notion of even without identifying as such, I do think some people's work is just they're artists, right? In one sense, right? And that's that balance of art therapy, which I think art is healing. It's a way of expressing how I feel versus an impulse to like no, this is what I do. I have to make. I want to make. You know, oh, you know, and now it's really interesting to hear you talk about the art being used as a way of diagnosing, right? Which is highly problematic because basically you're taking someone's almost like taking their personal journal, a place where it has intimate thoughts or things that you're releasing that, you know, you may or may not want to do or whatever, and then you're weaponizing it. And it's highly, that's as I listen to it, I'm like, man, like Like if anyone took our intimate thoughts and they could and lock like treated us based on that, that could be highly problematic to diagnose to solely, you know, in a way that.
But
that,
there are those, I think that even though that is problematic, I think that there are associations, I don't know how far they go clinical, but like in the art world with an artist, they do make those associations based upon the work, the visual.
Yeah, so we should lock up Damien Hirst. Damien Hirst needs to be locked up, but he's not. He's one of the top selling artists in the country. You know what I mean? So I'm just saying, yes, it's a little bit of this, you know, it's a percentage, but it just sounds like there was a time maybe that percentage was a little bigger, right? And as we know, when you put someone in certain situations, the things that are this big potentially can get bigger, right? You know, when you imprison people or types of treatment and things like that, you know. So it's just interesting. I never really thought about it like that. Once again, in those terms. So I was just saying, just reacting to what you said. But you know, yes, some people in certain situations are actually just have intuitive talent, like, you know, just naturally have a way of seeing the world and sharing that, and that can be really beautiful. But in cases like, you know, Margaret Burroughs teaching at Statesville Prison, they were the ones that were very, very talented artists. She taught in the prison system for years, and people like Sarah Ross and Damon Locks actually continue to pick up that banner and teach in the prisons, try to teach art.
Right.
We know the transformative nature of art, and I think those are two. Like, everyone should be taking art. All our students should be taking art. But specifically at Project Onward, it's not like a youth art program. It's not like a disabilities art program. They're actually artists that have challenges, but the artist comes first. So I do think it is important to differentiate the difference from doing art and the notion of art therapy as a way of helping you work through something, and then the ones that are artists that are in certain situations, or you know, you kind of help to identify them. Like, you're an artist, and someone has to tell you you're an artist. Like, I didn't know I was an artist until I had an art teacher telling me I was an artist. And then it took him 4 years before I actually believed that I was an artist. But he had to keep saying it. And then he showed me examples, and then my world kind of opened up. But yeah, I guess that's my point on that. I don't know if that answers the question, but it just, you know.
I mean, I do have one more thought about the context of that you talked about here, the prisons, hospitals, studios. I mean, you know, if you look to the sort of the most, you know, blue chip classic of the outsider artists, you know, people like Martin Ramirez and Wolfley, you know, they were in hospitals for 30 years. I mean, people went into psychiatric hospitals as young people and died there.
Sure.
Decades later. And, you know, Wolfley didn't start making art until like 5 years into his stay there.
Yeah.
And people were, patients were all expected at that time to work at the hospital laundry or in the vegetable garden or chop wood or whatever their jobs were on the grounds. And these were small self-sustaining towns. Wolfley had a doctor, Walter Morgenthaler, who recognized his talent and recognized the value of his making art. And even if he didn't describe it particularly as therapeutic, you know, there was a benefit because he was a difficult person, but much more settled when he was making art. And he basically said, you know, Wolfley's job is as artist. And so he got the time, he got the encouragement, and he got the supplies to develop his body of work. Fast forward to today, and people, you know, I'm not sure what the average stay now inpatient in this country is, but it's got to be measured in single-digit days.
Yeah.
That can't happen. You know, the place where people are, to concentrate that time is now prisons.
Right.
And these studio programs. You know, it takes any artist of any ilk time to develop their work, to be able to focus, to be able to concentrate on it. Psychiatric hospitals aren't those places anymore. But the studios, and to some degree prisons, I mean, prisons are more complicated because art and art materials becomes contraband, and, you know, in different ways there are there are issues around the support and encouragement of art making, but what they do share is this long-term focus of time.
Right. Right.
And I think maybe that, adding to that, Randy, it's a good point, because in places, I think out in the world, a lot of times, because of family situations, because of economic situations, it's kind of telling that in prison they have the time to do that art, or in a studio like ours, or in a psychiatric hospital as well. They have that almost ability to like hyper focus on and not have any distractions around them to make that work, and the opportunities.
Which is the same people, the same reason artists strive to go on residencies, where they're in a cabin or a studio somewhere and, you know, have that undisturbed time. I mean, I think it's far more, I think it's useful to talk about this kind of art, how it's distinct from mainstream art, but I think it's usually more instructive to look for the parallels to mainstream art, because I think that's even more telling.
How so? That's interesting to me.
Well, I mean, this issue of having the time and encouragement to make the art is essential. People just don't, you know, one day produce their first masterpiece without some sort of lead up to it.
Yeah, I 100% agree as well. You know, I thought, you know, in thinking about an artist, you know, a lot of these artists that we're talking about had an advocate. They had someone that could negotiate and take it from one space to another to see value. They had a champion.
Mm-hmm.
Any artist needs that. Like, you know, to your point of having space to focus, practice, and time. There is no like magical, like, they're artists. So there are similarities in the things that we want and need. You know, the assumption that somehow the needs differ in one space as another. I think once again, that's when I say this notion of the authentic experience is something that is used as a way of marketing the value of that thing, or a value of it, why this thing is special. When at the end of the day, it's an artwork, and there's an artist that saw it, and to your point, worked on it, rehearsed at it, did it over and over and over. And that's no different than what artists do in their studios. To your point, the residency is an exact thing. And oftentimes they are responding to their environment. You know, they're responding as a way of survival. Like, you know, it's like, I'm making art because I'm in a prison and I'm highly stressed, and it's the only time I can calm down is to do it. So they're reacting, right? And the more data, the more things they get access to. Like, just like you're saying, here are these sets of artists, right? That's a form of educating, right? So it's like, I'm gonna look at this artwork and I'm gonna respond. So the more things that start to come in, the more the work evolves. So it doesn't, even in the ways that we used to think about it, none of that operates in a bubble. It may be a very small bubble, but every time a collector comes in, every time someone walks in the door, that bubble gets bigger and bigger and bigger. I wrote down the isolated intuitive, you know, I just wrote that down. That seems to be something people are trying to search for and find. Where are those spaces of isolation and the spaces that people react intuitively in those spaces of isolation. And the beginning of the inspiration. Because once you're at an outsider art fair, if you're even living and able to see that, you can never go back to, you can tap into that spirit, you know where it comes from. But once you've been introduced, once someone comes and tells you quilt is artwork, You can't go back to making, now you're making shabby quilts. Like, you know, he's like, oh, I got to, you know, it's like, you can't unlearn that,
Right.
you know.
Right.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I think a lot of this goes back to what you were saying, Fahim, about just the power of being called an artist and being given the title of artist, which is incredibly powerful, and is for a lot of these artists, no one's ever been able to do that for them, because maybe it never made sense before, or they weren't in a space where that was even a consideration.
Right.
And Randy, your idea that there are all these there are parallels with mainstream art as well in terms of artists. You know, artists have this you know, incredible privilege to be, you are an artist, and so that has an immediate sense of value. And Randy, you can talk a lot about the value of social roles, and artists being a role that people recognize, that people with disabilities, or the kind of people who are involved in these studio programs, would never have had access to any sort of role in society. And the whole point was to maintain a distance from society. And this is a way of, like, it's sort of the paradox of embracing that, but also pushing past it and claiming a role in society as an artist, which is something that any person should be able to do. And I think sort of our role as facilitators, or people who work in these studio situations, that's really, it's really the job, is to empower the artist. And just starting with, you know what, you're an artist and you're here to be an artist. And so all sorts of things radiate from that.